All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight for the first part in the White Tank Mountains Regional Connectivity Initiative series, speaker series. The Conservancy, the White Tank Mountains Conservancy, has the pleasure of co-hosting this tonight with the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance, also known as CASCA. This three-part series will continue over the next two subsequent Wednesdays. Tonight's topic, What's at Stake? The Sonoran Desert Legacy, is an introduction into the White Tank Mountains Connectivity Initiative. And the story map, the critical wildlife connections that are going to be needed to sustain the area within and around the White Tank Mountains. And this is also a really great example of the collaborative work that is happening in the region that is needed as we move forward into the future. And so I'll go ahead and kick us off with my piece. My name is Anya Quiroz, and I am the engagement coordinator for the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance. I will be your MC for the night. And so thank you again so much for joining us. I see that Les has jumped on. I'm not sure if I should just keep going, Jamie, or if you want me to hand it off very quickly.
So why don't you go ahead and say your few introductory words?
Oh, go ahead, Les. All right, why don't I go ahead and just keep us going then. All right, so I'll go ahead and jump in, and I'll share my screen with y'all and get us started. So give me 1 second here. All right. And so what we're going to be talking about today is, the protection of the Sonoran Desert in this very unique region here in the greater Phoenix area. The Sonoran Desert is a very unique ecosystem that is in need of protection. Born only around 9,000 years ago, this area you see here in the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico is actually one of the youngest biotic communities, meaning the youngest of living organisms in modern North America. However, it is truly biodiverse with more than 60 mammal species, 4,000 plants, over 350 birds, 1,000 bees, and honestly, the list goes on. We are actually located right here. This landscape is treasured by Arizonans as well. Poll after poll, state and local residents cite the parks, preserves, and trails as the state's greatest assets and what they love the most about where they live. But there are challenges: rapid urban development, climate change, degradation, invasive species, and many more, which threaten this landscape. This is why we must work together to protect these habitats and the resources for future generations. We have to bridge the gap across sectors and communities. And this motivation, this impetus, is what led to the creation of the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance. We are an initiative of Desert Botanical Garden. It is our vision and our mission to see a sustainable preserved system, a regional network of healthy open spaces and natural areas that can help and benefit our communities, leaving a lasting legacy. We quickly realized that in order to do this, we needed a plan, a strategy that can help us move forward in that direction. And so CASCA set out to achieve this. After 18 months of hard work, multiple workshops, and bringing together multiple partners, we created altogether what is called the Regional Open Space Strategy for Maricopa County. This regional strategy was going to help us walk towards that vision of a regional holistic system of open spaces. And these are the 4 goals that were identified in that strategy. Identified within the first goal, Protect and Connect, was the creation of the green print, the CASCA green print. This was a map that was going to help us to plan better and also find opportunities for conservation and protection. We created this map with the help of many partners like the Arizona Game and Fish Department, Sonoran Institute, the Trust for Public Lands, and many more. The CASCA identified the area around the White Tank Mountains as high or very high to ensuring habitat integrity. And this is exactly what leads us to the topic for tonight and the 3-part series that we're going to be, that hopefully you will join us on, around the White Tank Mountains Conservancy, their White Tank Mountains Regional Connectivity Initiative. This exemplifies the kind of work called out for in the ROS and the Regional Open Space Strategy, and the collaborative solutions that will be needed to ensure we have both healthy ecosystems and healthy communities in the face of challenges that we have. And before I hand it off to our next speaker, let me go ahead and stop sharing here. But before I hand it off to our next speaker, we have just a few housekeeping items. If you please could remain muted throughout the duration of our talk, but we will have time for questions and answers at the end of each of our speakers. So if there's anything that comes up in the meantime, please go ahead and type that into the chat, and we will go ahead and get to those questions when we have time after each of our speakers. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our next speaker, who will actually help us hone in a little bit more into the region of the White-Taint Mountains, help us learn about the establishment of the parks, the White-Taint Mountains Conservancy, and a lot more. And so Dana Warnicki is with us tonight as our first speaker. Prior to retiring in the fall of 2019, Dana was with the Arizona Game and Fish Department's Habitat Evaluation and Lands program for 21 years. She was involved with the statewide department teams focused on wildlife linkage planning, with an emphasis on incorporating Western Maricopa County wildlife linkages into various regional development plans. Dana now supports the WTMC, the White-Taint Mountains Conservancy Regional Connectivity Initiative, as a biological consultant and a volunteer steward. I'll let Dana go ahead and take us off.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and great to be here. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. And can we see my presentation on the screen? Somebody give me a head nod.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Well, the White-Taint Mountains, a vibrant and wild landscape in the western edge of the Phoenix metropolitan area. As Anya mentioned, this is a landscape that is part of our state's Sonoran Desert legacy. This rugged mountain range encompasses over 94 square miles with steep mountain slopes that rise from the desert floor to nearly 4,000 feet. Today, these mountains remain mostly connected to the outlying lands of Western Maricopa County. Roughly 60% of this mountain range has been protected within 2 regional parks totaling over 38,000 acres. Visionary leaders established the Maricopa County Park System some 60 years ago, including the White-Taint Mountain Regional Park. Back in the day, many people thought the idea was ludicrous to preserve mountain ranges some 28 miles outside of Phoenix. They did not imagine that the valley would grow that big. Visionary leaders of today, such as Buckeye's former mayor, Jackie Meck, understood that that growth would continue to surge, and once again, built on the legacy of conserving the White-Taints by establishing Skyline Regional Park January of 2016. However, there is more conservation work to be done. In retrospect, we have learned from scientists that we also need connections between preserves and natural lands to help maintain ecological health over the long term. Today, wildlife still move in and out of the White-Taint Mountains, despite barriers such as the CAP Canal and I-10. Oops. However, there is a connectivity imperative. Future development plans, as proposed, will result in habitat loss, fragmentation, and isolation of the White-Taint Mountain ecosystem. If we preserve connections, we can try to minimize the ecological consequences. Everything in gray in this map is planned urban development around the White-Taint Mountains. Green areas are planned open space. What is missing for these mountains is connections between the open space and the outlying natural lands. We need connections for wildlife, plants, and ecosystem processes. To borrow the words of a wise man, we need to move away from thinking natural systems can be in our communities and think about how we can embed our communities within natural systems. The White-Taint Mountains Conservancy was established in 2015 by a diverse coalition of partners and volunteers conceived by the City of Buckeye and DMB Development. The mission set forth was to conserve the natural and cultural resources of the White Tank Mountains. The imperative to preserve landscape connectivity quickly became the Conservancy's primary focus to accomplish this mission. The Connectivity Initiative was launched to build a coalition of landowners, policymakers, citizens, and experts capable of reimagining and building an urban environment that conserves natural systems. This work will take generations. The stakes are high, but the potential benefits to people, wildlife, and ecosystems are immense. The white tanks are still wild and very much a part of Arizona's natural heritage, abundant with wildlife and visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. Home to wide-ranging species that require large amounts of connected habitat to maintain populations over time, as well as numerous other reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, and birds. Just within the White Tank Mountain Regional Park alone, dedicated birders have documented 138 different birds residing or migrating through on an annual basis. And let's not forget about plant biodiversity. Botanists, past and present, have cataloged hundreds of plant species within the White Tank Mountain Regional Park. Today, they continue to research what has changed over the last 50 years. Our world depends on connectivity to maintain natural ecosystems, to maintain diverse and healthy, resilient populations in the ecosystems they live in. Humans count on biodiversity and healthy ecosystems for food, shelter, and modern conveniences. The White Tank Mountains Conservancy believes that the ecosystem values of these mountains are worth protecting. We believe ecological connectivity supports vibrant communities and strong economies and healthy ecosystems. I want to thank you for joining us this evening on behalf of the White Tank Mountain Conservancy. We invite you to learn more about what's at stake by going to our website and story map using this QR code. And with that, I will pass the screen back.
Thank you, Dana. And so now we're going to move on to our second speaker of the night, Scott Sprague. With nearly 20 years with the Arizona Game and Fish Department, much of that time has been with the Contracts Branch Wildlife Connectivity and Highways team that focuses on road ecology and landscape connectivity across the Southwest. Scott is a great partner for both CASCA and WTMC, and we're so grateful to have him here tonight. I'll let him go ahead and take it off.
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, so I am here to talk kind of a little bit more about what's a little bit outside of what I focus on a day-to-day, because we're talking about what's at stake. And the program I've been working with for the last 20 years, it started off with a strong focus on road ecology and those linear barriers that wildlife have for movement. But it's expanded to look at wildlife connectivity. And so everything that we do because of what's at stake. And so I'm gonna spend a little bit of time kind of going through some of the general concepts and then kind of show how some of our work is tied in at a state level and then also at a local level to the White Tank Mountains and the Hassayampa Plains and the whole ecosystem around there. So
Oh, you kind of froze on there. You froze on us, Scott. Are you still there? Oh, we might have lost Scott. Scott, are you still with us? So let me, all right, well, while we get Scott back, we can go ahead and maybe move on to our next presenter. Okay, I hear, okay, he's trying to get back on. We'll give him a couple of minutes. Thanks, Tiffany. Sorry, y'all, some technical difficulties. Just hold on tight. Oh, here we go. He's back. There we go. Awesome. Hi, Scott. Are you back here with us? Oh, we see your screen, but we can't hear you. Okay, maybe he just needs a couple more minutes.
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
Just took me forever to find the mute button here. Yeah, sorry about that. It might be too much bandwidth for both my wife and I to be on here. Anyhow, sorry for the holding up on the gruesome slide, but it is a big part of what I do deal with on a day-to-day. Wildlife mortalities along the roads and the direct mortalities from vehicle collisions is the most obvious sign of highway impacts on wildlife, but it's not the only, by any means, the only impact, and it's maybe not even the most insidious. Here we have a deer out in its natural habitat. It's got some food, some water, and some shelter. It's even got a winter migration route that it can hang out in, it can use, and where it's got food, water, and shelter there. And then it can come back when the snows melt or when the vegetation greens up again in its other habitat. But if we start to build roads, as we start to build roads and infill those areas, as you would imagine, those animals aren't able to move around and get to the different things that they need in order to persist. So that's kind of a high level, but it's more than just, there's more than just one type of movement that can be interrupted by these different barriers. So if we have say Interstate 17 in this picture blocking elk in their daily movements between their shelter and their food and water, that's going to limit that's going to severely limit their population and their viability in that area. Think about it in human terms. If you had to get past a police line every time you wanted to get to your morning coffee, that would be a rough day, a rough every day. If we're looking at it in seasonal terms, those blockages could interrupt the migration routes, and that might not be critical every year, but sometime there might be a catastrophic or a really extreme weather event that can actually wipe out herds. We lost 70% of some pronghorn herds in a blizzard in 1968 because they couldn't get out of their habitat blocks. Their migration routes were blocked. And you can think of that in human terms. You know, if our snowbirds weren't able to move back and forth into and out of the Phoenix area, you know, as maybe some of you experienced these last couple of years, it's a lot more stressful than being able to make those movements, and a lot harder to survive in those circumstances. And then the last one here that I wanted to touch on is genetic exchange. So the populations, or each individual within the population, doesn't necessarily need to be able to move all across the landscape and interact with different populations, but some of them do, in order to keep the gene flow moving, in order to keep the gene pool from shrinking. And I could spend 20 minutes easily going into all the reasons why inbreeding is bad, but this picture kind of sums it up in my mind. So, you know, it's better, all animals are better off with a larger gene pool here. And so to look at that at the landscape level, what we get is when we fragment the habitat, we start off with all kinds of different species that are able to persist upon this uninterrupted landscape. But when we start cutting it up into smaller pieces, we start to lose species. The first one to go might be the mountain lion. And then as we get smaller, we might lose the bighorn sheep. We lose the deer and some of the others, until you get down so small that you might just have coyotes and rabbits. And eventually those will go away too. You know, I've seen one coyote near my house here in Central Phoenix. I've never seen a rabbit. So you get small enough chunks of habitat, and that disappears. And a great example of that is the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. We don't have mule deer in the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. I guarantee we did at one point, probably had bighorn sheep too, but we don't have them there anymore. There are not a whole lot of javelina there. There's still some, I believe, at least 10 years ago, last time we did some inventory work, there was definitely some sign, but there's not a lot there. And there's so many other species that are no longer there because they're not connected to those larger landscapes. A more hopeful example is the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. And by the way, I stole these examples right from from the Conservancy's web map, which is an amazing resource. So please dive into that. But to highlight this example for just a moment, the city of Scottsdale did recognize that that the southern portion of habitat here in the McDowell Mountains would not support a diverse ecosystem into perpetuity if they didn't provide some sort of connection with that northern polygon. Unfortunately, they didn't necessarily have a great amount of time. Their timeline didn't really allow them to pick the best biological corridor. They kind of had to deal with what was there. So there's a lot of work going into right now, kind of trying to figure out, well, how well is it going to work? So there's a lot of folks paying attention to that right now, and trying to, including our program. There's a lot of places across the state, a lot of folks across the state, a lot of different entities, including CASCA with the green print, trying to look at and identify the most important connections that are out there. There are lots of different iterations of this. These are 4 of kind of the big ones, and they're different scales, and they have different things going into them, and they have different values coming out of them. A lot of them are very theoretical still, and they're based on models that maybe don't have super strong data and empirical data from animal locations and movements that go into them. This data right here is from about 2012, I believe, mule deer study that occurred within the White Tank Mountains. And it shows each color dot, or each dot represents a deer location, and each color represents a different individual deer. So you can see the animals moving around there. And there was some analysis done of this to try and highlight some of those important areas and movement pathways around the White Tank Mountains. This next map is actually mountain lion, essentially home ranges, you could probably call them. We call them minimum convex polygons. Basically is what it means is that it draws a line around every location from that particular animal in the smallest shape possible. So we have 3 different individual lions here. And I want to point out that this blue one, I think it is, or maybe it was the red, one of these 2 smaller ones, only represents 6 months of lion movement. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the red one here. This white one represents, I think, a year or more. And you can see that mountain lion moved from the White Tanks through the bighorns, the Belmonts, the bighorns, the vultures, and even up to the Harquahalas. Those cats are moving a lot. These are actually all females as well. And male mountain lions tend to have even larger home ranges than females. Unfortunately, we don't have any collar data from animals and mountain lions in that area. So this map here shows, again, just that one mountain lion that really got a move on across the landscape. That green polygon in here, that shows a very early draft of an early draft of a wildlife linkage that maybe was suggesting that would be a good way to connect the Belmonts to the White Tank Mountains. This polygon you see here is another one of those draft linkages. This is not a finalized product. There's a lot of stuff that goes in, that those deer locations and those mountain lion locations and a lot of other information has gone into this, but there's still room for a lot more input to process through to figure out what's not just the best biological, but also the best the most feasible in terms of considerations for development and landscape planning and so forth. And we want to make sure that we are really nailing the best biological information in here that we can possibly get, because a lot of the mitigation that we need to make happen if we want to this ecosystem to persist it's not necessarily cheap. It's a significant investment. And so one of the ways we're trying to hone that stuff down, we're putting out more collars. And this effort was particularly influenced by the potential for Interstate 11 to cross this landscape west of the White Tank Mountains. So we went out and we collared a bunch of mule deer out there, 20 mule deer to start with, and maybe about another dozen or so in subsequent years. We put collars on them and we kicked them out and sent them on their way. And each collar is going to be generating a GPS location every 3 hours for a total of 3 years. So it's something around 8,000 locations that each one of those collars can generate. And that gives us a whole lot of data. This is actually from an earlier capture, but I just loved this news byline so much that I had to share it with everybody. And they also got it wrong. They said these were two gentlemen from Game and Fish. These are both women from Game and Fish, and they were quite offended that they weren't represented appropriately by the news. Anyhow, this is the data that we've gotten back. This is actually up through this month in October from just actually a small chunk of the I-11 project, but it's this Hassayampa Plains ecosystem. And you can see some pretty cool stuff in here. Before I zoom in a little bit on the white tanks, I wanted to draw attention to this. This animal right here, this collar was deployed last October, and it was deployed up here in the vultures, and it made a movement in December down here to the Harquahalas or the Bighorns, whatever this range is. And then in May, it moved back. So this could actually be a desert migration. Just for a little bit of context, a lot of our deer don't actually migrate every year, particularly those lower elevation animals. But we are seeing some across the state. Pretty much everywhere we put out collars, we're seeing some interesting seasonal movements, not by all the whole population, but just by some subsets of them. So this is zoomed in a little bit more on the White Tank Mountain collar deployments. And you can see we've got some cool crossings of Sun Valley Parkway and some nice interesting stuff moving out off of and among the preserves in there, the parks. This is actually bighorn sheep data that we collected at the same time. We started the deployments at the same time. You'll notice that there's no bighorn sheep data from the white tanks. Historically, we don't have any records. I haven't checked the books to see how far back it goes. There were probably bighorn sheep here at some point, but in the recent past, we don't know of any. There's a pretty good population out here in the Belmonts and the Bighorns, and some down towards Gila Bend. And you can see they're moving across this landscape pretty well. But of note is February, so during this movement data collection, in February of 2020, and then about 2 weeks later in mid-March, there were 2 bighorn sheep detected within White Tank Mountain Regional Park. And they were detected, like I said, a couple of weeks apart. So they were out and about in the park. These are 2 rams. They are probably wanderers. It's kind of standard for bighorn sheep population dynamics that you'll have some of these folks disperse to new ranges and repopulate or populate new mountain ranges. So it's very possible, if we keep those pathways open, that bighorn sheep will populate the White Tank Mountains and become residents there. They're not there now, or at least no one's seen them that I'm aware of since last March, since a year ago March, but they could easily come back at this point. So those are some of the ways in which we're trying to narrow down where we're going to do stuff. When we do decide on those types of things, we want to get those linkages, those corridors identified, and where any of those corridors and movement pathways are crossing or need to cross either an existing or a new roadway, we want to make sure that they have the right tools, the wildlife have the right tools to get across them. I'm not going to dive into this. We spend a lot of our time looking at these crossing structures and figuring out what are the best ones for different species and the best placements and the best systems. I do want to at least mention that fencing is always key, just because it is so important and often gets left out of the conversation. But fencing is required for any of these structures to really work. And then I just want to reiterate that we really want to use the best available science to steer the efforts to make a difference for what's at stake. And some of those things that we see might be of value still in this landscape are some road mortality assessments, potentially additional movement data for other species, some fence inventories and modifications that can help improve the existing connectivity across there, and then possibly some surveys for some of those species of greatest conservation need that might not have gotten into the scope of things so far. I also wanted to put in a quick plug. In April of next year, myself and a handful of others and actually not a handful, a load of other folks, a lot of other partners are involved in this effort to do a BioBlitz across the Hassayampa ecosystem. We are looking to generate some inventory data and to increase the advocacy for the area, particularly with the Interstate 11 potential in the future. We want to make sure that folks are dedicated to keeping this landscape connected across that area. I'm going to skip through this because I think I'm running over. This is just kind of a quick summary. It was supposed to be a quick summary of what's really at stake, and showing that there's these different groups out there. Again, and coming back to the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, all we really have left out there are coyotes. Not all we have left, but we've lost so many species out there. There's still a lot there, but of those larger mammals, we basically just have coyotes, maybe a few javelina, maybe a bobcat or a fox or two, but really not all that much more. So many of those large species are gone, and South Mountain isn't far behind. It's been a long time since a deer's been seen there, and mountain lions as well. So that's what's at stake, is not ending up like the Phoenix Mountains Preserve, but keeping what wildlife is there in the Hassayampa ecosystem right now. And then, so that's all I had. I'm going to play this video of some bighorn sheep using a wildlife overpass. And if anybody has any questions, I'll just let the video play.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'll leave it open if anybody wants to unmute and shout out any questions for Scott. I do have one question in the chat, but yeah, leave it open for a minute or so if anyone does have anything. All right. In the meantime, I actually do have one question, but this is actually aimed at Dana, or actually Les as well, either or. Madeline asks, can you name any planned developments that you are most concerned about? I don't know if either of you might want to address that question.
I'll go ahead and start. No, the answer would be nothing specific, but what we can say is that development in general out in that region has been slowed over the years due to the different, economic slowdowns that we've experienced largely since 2008. But things are picking up. And what we do know is that within both cities, there are several community master plans, that have already, to a certain extent, gone through their approval processes and what we call entitled. And so once, things really start to pick up, they could potentially happen very fast. So nothing specific, that we're worrying about that I can identify in all fairness. This is a great session maybe, or a great question for one of our city partners at session 2 next Wednesday.
That is a great motivator, Dana, for session number 2. If anyone wants to join us for that, that's happening next Wednesday. But we'll go ahead and, we have one more question from Allison. Why do we allow hunting at the white tanks? I'm not sure if this is Scott or Dana or a question there, but maybe Scott, but thanks.
Sure, I can jump in there. So hunting is without getting into a long diatribe, hunting is an amazing way to actually support wildlife conservation. For decades, it was actually the primary means by which there was funding put forward for wildlife conservation. So they call it the North American model. Again, I could go on and on, but the bottom line is that they do look very closely at the population levels, and so if there were a concern about the say the mule deer population within the white tanks, they could and would adjust the number of tags or even eliminate that option from the table. But to be fair, as far as from a population standpoint, the harvesting of bucks, of males, doesn't have much of an impact on the actual population level for that area, for any given area.
Thanks, Scott. I'm not sure if Les maybe had a word. I know he unmuted. I think we're having a hard time hearing you, Les, but we can come back to you. We do have one more question before we jump ahead into the next speaker. And I'll go ahead and maybe address this to either Scott or Dana, but the next one is from Rebecca. Hi, Les. Well, if you can jump in at any point, but let's go ahead and go to that last question. Would the creation of corridors look to restore the larger animals or focus on not losing the current animals in the area?
I would say both. And so, you know, the larger animals, if it works for the larger animals, there's a pretty fair chance that it will work for the smaller animals as well. The larger animals tend to need a larger area to roam, but those smaller animals still need connectivity for, if nothing else, for that gene flow that I talked about early on. So yeah, we typically do manage for those larger species for a number of different reasons, but we do that with the knowledge that they should benefit the smaller stuff and those common species. That keeping the common species common is a recurring phrase for us too.
Thank you, Scott. All right, we'll go ahead and jump into the next speaker here. And I think the next question we have actually might be answered through some of the information that our next speaker will share. But I'll go ahead and introduce them. We have Dr. Jessie Lewis and Kayla Hamilton that are joining us tonight as our third and fourth speaker of the night. Dr. Jessie Lewis is an assistant professor at Arizona State University. His research focuses on the effects of human activities on wildlife populations. Meanwhile, Kayla is a graduate student at Arizona State University, working in Dr. Lewis's lab, studying wildlife use of crossing structures on the Cap Canal. And so they'll help us kind of, explore the topic further from what Scott was talking about. And thank you so much again, Scott, for joining us. I'll go ahead and pass that off to Dr. Jessie and Kayla.
All right. Well, terrific. Yeah. Thank you, Anya. And good evening, everyone. And thanks for inviting us here to speak today and share some of our research in the Phoenix Valley and White Tanks area. So we're going to be talking about wildlife habitat connectivity across multiple scales. So thinking about across the whole Phoenix Valley, and then more specifically along the CAP Canal. And so I'm Dr. Jessie Lewis at Arizona State University. I'm only going to speak for a couple minutes, and I'm going to turn it over to Kayla Hamilton, who's going to tell us about her research project as part of some work in our lab looking at the CAP Canal, and also want to acknowledge our collaborator, Thomas Bomarito, with the Bureau of Reclamation. All right, so just to kind of briefly set the stage, we're working on a number of different projects evaluating the effects of urbanization and other landscape factors like water, plant productivity, those kinds of things on wildlife populations, a whole suite of different wildlife species. And so first, just talk about the Phoenix Valley Wildlife Project. We can look over on the right here at this figure, and the areas of red represent areas of high levels of urbanization. So kind of in the middle, that's Phoenix, of course, Tempe and so forth. And then the areas of green are relatively undeveloped, or they're places without residential development. So like up in the northeastern area, that's like the McDowells. And then kind of down in the south, we have South Mountain. And then where that circle is over there to the west, on the left-hand side there, that's the white tanks. And so each one of those yellow circles represents one of our wildlife cameras, which we'll talk more about, look at some photos in just a moment. And so we placed these 50 wildlife cameras across a gradient of urbanization to try to understand, how do a whole suite of wildlife species respond? And we'll talk about that project more in just a moment. And the other project, just real quick, is we're doing a project along the Salt River and kind of asking similar questions. How does wildlife community change across the Salt River? We won't talk about that today, but hopefully at another point in time. And then I also just wanted to, give a big thank you and acknowledge to the CAP LTR at ASU, and also the Urban Wildlife Information Network, and many collaborators for making all this work possible. All right, so, for these studies, and we'll talk about kind of the Phoenix Valley Project in particular, we deploy wildlife cameras to sample wildlife populations. And, we've documented the entire wildlife community, or a large proportion of the wildlife community, ranging from small to large size animals. And so on the left here, we have coyotes, and then gray fox, bobcat, mule deer, mountain lions, roadrunner, black-tailed jackrabbits, cottontail rabbits, quite a few domestic cats, especially in the more urbanized areas. 3 different species of skunk. This is, of course, showing the striped skunk, and many other species as well, javelina and rock squirrels and so forth. So this is across all of our wildlife cameras throughout the Phoenix Valley. And we'll look here at just those 2 cameras that we had over in the white tanks. And so this is in Goat Canyon. There's kind of a trail that follows one side of this. Might have been up there before. And it's on the east side of the park. And so get a lot of bobcats and mule deer that travel up and down that wash. And gray fox, very common up there. It looks like this gray fox has a rock squirrel it just caught. Sometimes we'll get carnivores, carrying their prey items. And then wildlife in the competitive track wash, kind of in the northeast part of the white tanks. So a lot of different species. A lot of these species occur at the other site as well, but some small mammals like desert cottontail, of course, roadrunners, gamble quail. Then javelina, really common, traveling up and down the wash. You can see on the left, there's a little guy there. So we get the adults as well as the juveniles. Lots of mule deer that move up and down the wash. They're definitely one of the more common species that we detect on the wildlife cameras. And of course, coyotes, they're very common and they kind of occur almost everywhere. But we get quite a few coyotes going up and down the wash as well. And then lastly, bobcats. And we're going to focus on the next slide, just talking a little bit more about bobcats, specifically as kind of a little case study. And so this is for data across all of the Phoenix Valley, the 50 cameras that I mentioned previously. And so we can use that information, kind of like the relative abundance or the relative use of species. So where we see a lot of bobcat photos or very few or no bobcat photos, relate that to different habitat variables, such as urbanization, plant productivity, water, things like that, to create these predictive maps of habitat quality. So here's a predictive map of habitat quality for bobcats. I want to emphasize this is just preliminary and kind of for demonstrative purposes at this point in time, but this is things that we're continuing to work on. But so areas of red represent low quality habitat. We're really unlikely to see a bobcat. Like, Scott was mentioning the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. It's kind of, we have gotten a few bobcat photos over there, but not many. But you're certainly not going to see any bobcat photos in the middle of Phoenix or anything like that. And then the green is relatively high quality habitat for bobcats. And again, highlighting the white tanks area with that circle And like we talked about quite a few bobcat photos in the white tanks. And so we'll just kind of zoom in on that area real quick. And so for just the white tanks specifically, here's the prediction of bobcat habitat quality. Again, it's just preliminary, but you can see that the white tanks is very green, so it's relatively high quality habitat for bobcats. And this information can be used to evaluate habitat quality for species, as well as potential connectivity and movement corridors for animals, and not just bobcats, but for a whole variety of different species once we have completed those models and those predictive models of habitat quality as well. So the next steps are to finalize processing the wildlife camera data, and there's a whole team of people that are involved with that. Again, want to say thank you to a lot of people for this. And then once that's ready, kind of the plan for 2022 was to really dive into this more, evaluate habitat quality for diversity of local species, including bobcats, coyotes, mule deer, most of the species that we looked at previously. And so, hopefully we'll have some more results to share with everybody in the near future. And so with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Kayla Hamilton, and she's going to tell us about a project that she's working on also in her lab.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for setting us up and introducing me. I'm Kayla. I'm a master's student at ASU working in Dr. Lewis's lab, and my master's thesis, which is being performed in collaboration with the Bureau, Thomas Bomarito at the Bureau of Reclamation, is to evaluate wildlife use of crossing structures on the Central Arizona Project Canal. Oops. So I have a little bit of background here. I think Scott already did a really great job of summarizing most of this, but I'll just do a little brief intro here. So anthropogenic linear infrastructures, or alleys, which include things like roads, railways, and canals, are essential to the transportation of people and resources across landscapes. However, they can also act as filters or barriers to wildlife movement. So as Scott talked about earlier, they can present direct mortality threats to wildlife through collisions with vehicles on roads or drowning in canals, or indirect mortality threats to wildlife by just restricting wildlife movement through the landscape and restricting access to habitat patches on either side of the linear infrastructures. Luckily, crossing structures have been shown to be effective measures to increase connectivity for wildlife across linear infrastructures. So Scott showed some pictures of overpass crossing structures over roads, but here we're going to be focusing specifically on crossing structures over canals, or the CAP canal. So the CAP canal, it provides critical water resources for agricultural, municipal, industrial, and recreational uses in South Central Arizona. So the CAP canal starts at the Colorado River and then travels east through Phoenix and then goes down south through Tucson. It is unfortunately a major linear barrier for some wildlife species in the Sonora Desert due to the fact that it's too wide for most animals to cross, and it's also fenced for its entire length, meaning that they just can't get in to access the canal at all, which is in part also to reduce the deaths by drowning for wildlife. However, the CAP canal does have crossing structures built into it, which are designed to help facilitate wildlife movement across the canal. So my study, which is being performed for my thesis, has three central aims. The first is to determine which species use the overpasses and how frequently. The second is to evaluate how wildlife use of overpasses changes based on environmental and structural factors and across seasons. And the third is to evaluate the influence of human activities on spatial and temporal patterns and wildlife use of overpasses. I'm still currently collecting data from my crossing structures, so I haven't had the chance yet to perform any analyses. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to be focusing on study aim number one, which is to determine which species use the overpasses. So just a little context for the study area. I have set up wildlife cameras at 56 crossing structures on the CAP canal, spanning 2 study regions, one to the west of Phoenix and one down to the south of Phoenix, or the northwest of Tucson. On this map, yellow dots represent overpasses and green dots represent siphons, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about those types of crossing structures in a moment. But first, I just want to kind of zoom in to a specific region of the canal, which is associated with the White Tanks Mountains. So for this presentation, I'll be summarizing some data from 11 crossing structures associated with the White Tanks, which include 9 overpasses and 2 siphons. So just to go into the types of crossing structures that we have on the canal, I'm categorizing them into basically wildlife bridges, cement overshoots, and siphons. Within the category of wildlife bridges, I have wide and narrow bridges. However, there are no wildlife bridges in specifically the White Tanks Mountain region. So I just wanted to throw this out there, but for this presentation, we'll be focusing on cement overshoots and siphons. So cement overshoots are wide concrete structures that are very flat and then have a 45-degree downward slope on the downslope side of the canal. And siphons are areas where the canal travels underground, usually for a pretty wide area. Siphons typically exhibit natural landscape characteristics such as vegetation and washes that help facilitate wildlife movement across the canal. And again, I've positioned wildlife cameras at each crossing structure on the canal that I'm monitoring here to take pictures of wildlife. Okay, so going back, this is for the entire study area. So I've summarized some data here for 3 months in the springtime, February, March, and April, for a total over a total of 43 sites. We've detected 17 wildlife species at these sites and in this kind of time frame. As you can see, we've detected a wide range of small, medium, and large-sized species, including bighorn sheep, badgers, gray fox, ring-tailed cat, mountain lion, and striped skunk. On the table here, we have the species on the left, the number of detections, which corresponds basically to the number of photos or pictures that we got of each species. And then on the right side of the table, we have the total number of sites that each species was detected at. I've bolded a couple of focal species here. These species, bobcat, collared peccary, coyote, and mule deer, are wide-ranging and highly mobile species that could henceforth be particularly vulnerable to the effects of fragmentation from anthropogenic linear infrastructures. So I'm going to be going into a little bit more detail about these species later in the presentation. But first, I wanted to zoom back into the White Tanks region. So again, this is from 11 structures associated with the White Tanks Mountain on the CAP Canal. We've got 9 overpasses and 2 siphons. We've detected a total of 12 species in the 3-month timeframe across these 11 structures. Again, we have a wide range of small, medium, and large-sized animals, ranging from very common species like coyote, collared peccary, black-tailed jackrabbit, and mule deer, to far less common species like the badger, the burro or wild donkey, mountain lion, and raccoon. So all the pictures starting here and for the rest of the presentation are going to be specifically from the White Tanks Mountains, starting with the kit fox in the top left corner, the wild donkey, the black-tailed jackrabbit, and the badger. So now going into those focal species that I had bolded in the previous 2 tables, I'm going to focus first on the bobcat. So in the table here, we have a bridge ID, which corresponds to an ID listed on the map here for my crossing structures. And then we have the total number of detections or photos for bobcats for each month at each structure. And on the far right hand side of the table, the total number of pictures that we got for each bridge. So you can see that we've detected bobcat a total of 21 times. And this is for the same 3-month period, February, March, and April. So I'm just going to throw a few colored circles up. So red corresponds with structures that experienced high use by bobcat. The dark orange represents moderate use, and the light orange represents low use. So you can see that bobcat were detected at several crossing structures associated with the White Tanks Mountains. In particular, we have these 2 crossing structures kind of like straight to the northwest tip of the White Tanks Mountains. And in general, bobcat were using structures to just the northwest of the White Tank Mountains, as opposed to this kind of region near Surprise up in the northeast. So moving on to coyote, we have a similar table here. Coyote were detected a total of 371 times at these 11 structures for our 3-month time frame. Coyote were actually detected at every crossing structure that we were monitoring during this time frame. You might notice that B28 here doesn't have a circle around it. That's because while we did initially deploy a camera at that site, unfortunately, it was immediately stolen. And also on the table, you'll notice that there's a few asterisks where we're missing data. Again, that's because we unfortunately had some additional thefts out here in the surprise area. But regardless, we can see that coyote are using a wide range of crossing structures across the entire study area. But again, in particular, they're using these two structures right to the northwest tip of the White Tanks Mountains, as well as this structure, which is right next to the US 60 over in the northeast. Moving on to mule deer, they were detected a total of 88 times in this study area across this time frame. Mule deer are quite interesting. You can see that they're only detected at crossing structures primarily to just the western edge of the White Tank Mountains. Their most highly used crossing structure was this siphon here in Star Wash, which is also called Jackrabbit Wash, for those of you that are familiar with the area. But they did use several of these also overpass crossing structures to the west of the White Tanks. And finally, I have peccary summarized here. So they were detected a total number of 105 times at these structures during this time frame. Similar to peccary were detected at nearly every crossing structure associated with the White Tanks Mountain region. Again, they were most frequently detected at this site close to the US 60 over here, but they were using overpass crossing structures across the entire study region summarized here. And you may have noticed in the table, and I think I mentioned it, but we did also get one mountain lion detection in this 3-month period, and that occurred at this overpass right in between the two washes / valley. So this is kind of generally all the Hacienda River Valley area. But I thought it was quite interesting that we had detected the mountain lion kind of right in this really kind of rugged area in between those two washes. And then also, before I conclude, I wanted to mention that we also are documenting human use of the crossing structures on the CAP Canal. I'm interested in evaluating how different types of human activities can potentially influence wildlife use of the crossing structures. So we've documented humans engaging in activities such as equestrian, biking, all-terrain vehicle use, hunting, and of course, hiking. Specifically in the White Tanks region, we detected humans a total number of 143 times. And again, they were detected at every crossing structure that we have summarized here today, although somewhat predictably, they were pretty concentrated around the city of Surprise in this area, kind of to the northeast of the White Tank Mountains. Although again, they were detected across the entire study region that I've summarized here. So in summary, some species used almost all of the crossing structures associated with the White Tanks Mountains. So coyotes actually did use all the crossing structures in this region, and peccary used all but one. On the other hand, some species used several crossing structures associated with the western side of the White Tank Mountains in particular. So these structures from B20 to B23 seemed to be a bit of a hotspot for animals like the peccary, bobcat, not the peccary, the mule deer, bobcat, and mountain lion.
Thank you so much, Kayla.
Oh, I'm still going.
Sorry.
Just like 2 more minutes, sorry. So just to kind of wrap it up here, wildlife are using overpasses to cross the canal, which is really wonderful to document. However, ensuring wildlife movement across the CAP Canal is essential to the maintenance and conservation of connectivity across our landscape. So maintaining access to crossing structures for wildlife is really vital to the long-term conservation and management of wildlife populations. And just to bring this back really briefly at the end, I do have 2 other study aims that I haven't addressed here today. So I will be looking at environmental and structural factors. So that's things like vegetation cover, topography, land use type, and then like structure dimensions, and see how those factors are influencing wildlife use of the crossing structures, particularly across different seasons. And I'll be evaluating the influence of human activities on spatial and temporal patterns and wildlife use of overpasses. So my cameras are going to be out for 1 year. They're coming down next February, and then I'll be doing lots of analysis next year. So hopefully I'll have some more to talk about in the near future. That's all I have. If you have any questions for myself, Dr. Lewis, or Thomas Malmerito, again, our collaborator, please feel free to ask them here or send us an email.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Sorry about that interruption.
No worries.
This was so much data. It's so wonderful to see both, Scott's presentation and both your work with Dr. Lewis really showing us what is at stake. All these different wildlife species that we have in the plentiful biodiversity that we have in this region, and what we have to protect. We do have a couple questions that came up in the chat. I will go ahead and shoot you guys the first one. What adverse effects is there for wildlife when people explore or walk along the overpasses? And I'll let
sorry. That's a great question, and one that I will be investigating very soon once my data collection is complete. We are predicting potential impacts on wildlife, like potentially wildlife shifting their daily activity patterns in response to human use, although humans typically are active during the day and most wildlife species in the desert are more active at night. But we'll be looking at activity shifts and then also just changes in use among structures that are used more by humans or less by humans. So I can't answer that now, but hopefully in a year I will be able to.
And I know, Scott, you turned your video on. I don't know if you want to address the question, but we also do have another question that perhaps you could also help us with.
Sure. I just wanted to say real quick that we definitely have monitored, and a lot of folks out there have monitored road overpasses and underpasses, lots of wildlife structures. And as you would expect, the more human activity, the less wildlife activity. And so we definitely try to steer away from dual use structures where there's going to be a lot of overlap. It would undermine it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and move to our next speaker for tonight. And I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Paul Cosio. He's an associate professor of Arizona State University. And Kayla, would you mind stop sharing? Or Dr. Lewis, I'm not sure who is sharing the screen. Perfect, thank you.
Sorry.
No worries. All right, perfect. So moving on. Dr. Paul Cosio is an associate, and apologies if I said that wrong, Paul, is an associate professor, coordinator of the Master of Urban Design program, and licensed landscape architect at Arizona State University's Design School. At ASU, he investigates how landscape architecture, planning, and design strategies can reduce extreme urban microclimates and for more thermally comfortable and equitable communities. Extreme urban microclimate conditions can disrupt energy systems, water quality and availability, and also residents' routines, incomes. It can degrade quality of life, threaten residents' health and well-being, and create challenges for urban sustainability and resilience. Working at the intersection of meteorology, landscape architecture, and urban planning, he developed a focus area in landscape architecture called urban climate design, which integrates urban climatology, urban ecology, thermal equity, and participatory research and design processes that can help reshape neighborhood atmospheres. And I'll pass it off to Dr. Paul. And of course, if you guys have any questions, we will address them at the end of this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, excellent. I didn't see my screen, hopefully.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Just got to check those couple things in Zoom world. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And it's been a really fascinating discussion today, and I'm going to contribute to it in a slightly different way. I also work with Jesse at CAP LTR. I sort of am in a different wing of CAP LTR, where we take an ecology for cities approach, where we really try to take the latest evidence and research that we understand about urban ecological systems and work with partners such as the White Tank Mountain Conservancy to put that knowledge into action. And I've been working with Les and Dana and others at White Tank Mountain Conservancy since 2016 to explore avenues for more urban ecological infrastructure, green infrastructure, as some might say, for this particular Hassayampa Plain ecosystem. And so today I'll be talking about the Sonoran Desert Ecosystem Services that we've inherited, that we have benefited from past generations' preservation of this particular ecosystem, and what kind of values we want to, as a larger community, as we start to develop this area, you know, how do we want to lead that type of development? And ecosystem services is really a growing term. Many of you may be familiar with it, but I'll kind of explain it as we go through. And a key piece to this, and you've already heard it tonight, is that connectivity really impacts those ecosystem services, and those ecosystem services impact us as people and as communities. And so it really does impact everyone. This is an image that I'm showing here from a hike that I took a couple weekends ago in the White Tank Mountains. And you know, again, I'm coming from a planning perspective and design perspective. And so this is a quote that I really like from Anne Spurn. And actually it's from 2003, and she's a landscape architect scholar. And she talks about that there is an ecological approach to doing planning and design and development, although it's typically not a mainstream. And unfortunately, as it was in 2003, it's still not. But it does have a strong tradition, and it does have a foundation of knowledge. And again, CAP is helping to develop that and apply that within the Phoenix metropolitan area. And really, you know, she ends this quote by kind of emphasizing this idea of benefits. And we'll kind of dig into that in this presentation. One thing that, as we were planning for the presentation, we really wanted to connect with is that, you know, there's lots of things that have come out of the pandemic, but there's also been a great reawakening to open space and parks as really critical to who we are as people, as how we are able to adapt, repair, socialize. And so there's this exercise activity called Chatterfall. I don't know if anybody's ever done it before. So I'm going to ask you all to bear with me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you this question that's up here. What parks, preserves, or open spaces helped you, your family, or community through the pandemic? You know, what was that refuge that really helped you socialize with friends, seek mental health therapy, be able to escape the virus for a little bit? And what I want you to do is I want you to type this into the chat, your answer, but do not hit send. And then we're going to all hit send at the same time. I've seen this exercise done where people play music and other things like that for entertainment. But I'm going to just, since this has been up a minute and I've been talking a minute, you all probably know instantly what this landscape is going to be, this place is going to be. So I'm going to wait another 20 seconds, and then I'm going to tell you to hit send, and then everyone hit send at the same time. Okay, so now I'll count you down. All right, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everyone hit send. Awesome. Amazing. Yeah, so we all have these spaces outside, and I think it's even grown in importance to people that maybe have either lost that in their life or have maybe never had as much as they needed it during the pandemic. And this is not a local phenomenon, certainly. I mean, honestly, it's probably a world phenomenon, but there's a lot of conversation now in the media, in a lot of nonprofits. This is a report from the Trust for Public Lands on parks in the pandemic. I encourage you to go find the URL. The URL is right here, but to go and read through this. And they have a variety of different articles that are really fascinating about the way in which our value system on multitudes of front, right, have really been shaken loose and disrupted by the pandemic, and now we're sort of realigning our values. And one of those values is the values of open space and outdoor space. And so here's a couple of articles. I like the one on the bottom left that talks about parks as essential infrastructure, right? And that we really need to be conserving, preserving, and investing in that kind of green infrastructure. And then this trend is also colliding with another trend that's been going on for a while in urban development, and we've explored this with the White Mountain Conservancy as well, is even if you do have development, can you integrate into the landscape ecological principles that that provide benefits both to people and to wildlife. And so there's local and national trends, and I have a picture here of Optima Camel View in Scottsdale for people that are familiar with that project, where landscape is actually integrated into the building as a series of terraces. On the lower left, you see a slow motion video of a pollinator bee at my Arizona bluebells on my green roof, where we're doing experiments about what plants actually do well with very little irrigation that are native, that can actually thrive integrated into buildings. And then actually I ran across this article on the right from New York Times. So this weekend, it was serendipitous that actually there's a lot of trends in economic or real estate development that people highly value green space as part of their development. And so even if we do development, there's these trends that are sort of leading themselves. So one is sort of trends in terms of open space and preserving that, but also if we do develop, how we develop differently potentially. And so, a lot of the work in terms of ecosystem services are things that we need to think about in terms of values. And we sort of need to unpack that in terms of values as well, because different communities have different values. And so when we think about values, we can ask a series of questions around whose values. In many cases, we have a dominant culture that dominates that value of what things should be important, right? But we have a very diverse, pluralistic society where we have diverse cultural values, and so we need to look at those and look at the heritage that people have in their connections to the land, public versus private. What are those values? So in many cases, when we talk about economic development, it's economic, right? Not environmental development or social development, right? Or community development. So we can kind of unpack that or challenge those. And increasingly, that's becoming part of the conversation when we talk about urban design and community development. Where those values are impacting, and we can talk to them at scales that are smaller, like the site, neighborhood, cities, regions, watersheds. Here we're talking about larger landscapes, right? That even cross the Hassayampa River watershed, right? And so bringing that into the conversation as a kind of critical piece to what we value as people of this place. Why certain values? So the arguments for it, the evidence in terms of science, or public opinion, right? And so those all come into play. And then when those values impact. So we have a legacy in the central Phoenix Valley of having to contend with previous generations' values, right? Values of economic development, values of auto-centric kind of development. And so we really need to think in this both intra and intergenerational way in terms of thinking about values. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that tonight. In terms of, just unpacking ecosystem services, of course, ecosystems are the organisms and their physical environment in an integrated system. And we've heard a lot about that tonight. And when we think about ecosystems, we can also unpack that in terms of the structure of the ecosystem and then those critical functions that go on. And those functions are really the basis for ecosystem services. And if we kind of look at a graphic of the Sonoran Desert, and we can understand the structure in terms of the plant communities, the animal communities, and the soils and slopes and atmosphere that interacts with that, and rainfall and hydrology and all of those things together as a connected system, we can then understand better that function that is the basis for ecosystem services. And in particular, connectivity is really critical, as we heard tonight. And I think Scott drove it home really, really nicely in terms of we know really well what happens when you cut off landscapes. And that by removing species, you also then, in many cases, diminish those ecosystem services that those landscapes are providing. And so, and again, I encourage you, just like Scott did and others tonight, to go to the story map. The story map has a really great, rich way of starting to discuss these ideas. And so the story map, they talk about ecosystem services as these benefits, right, that are derived from the environment when we have ecosystems that are healthy. The other way to kind of, again, think about it in terms of when you're kind of putting things into areas, or here de Groot calls them value domains. There's certainly economic, social, cultural, and ecological kind of domains that we can think about in terms of what we value. And they had a really, de Groot and colleagues had a really nice graphic in their article that they produced that talks about the ecosystems and biodiversity, and kind of unpacks what ecosystem services are, in terms of that they're not all ecosystem functions, they're just the ones that we really value. And in fact, the groups that I work with at ASU in terms of the CAP LTR, there are also increasing discussion of disservices that happen along with the services. And so these are kind of a few ways to sort of understand ecosystem services. And further, scholars have really started to understand them and package ecosystem services into 4 big buckets. There are supporting services that are sort of necessary for the critical production of other ecosystem services. There are provisioning services that are needed to produce food and sustenance in particular for humans. In many of the work that I do, as was talked about earlier, is regulating services and regulation of our atmosphere and our atmosphere's ability, in particular, in terms of the desert, to rapidly cool at night. And we've taken that away by putting in urban development in many cases. And then those cultural services that are the ways in which we survive the pandemic, right? The spiritual connections, the intellectual curiosity, the ways that nature provides those for us. And so when we think about the Hassayampa Plain ecosystem, we can point out a few things. And I think one thing that really strikes me from the story map, and also from just working over the years, is the really critical piece that the river and wash system play. The hydrology, whether you're a developer or an ecologist or biologist, it's where the conversation is. And so this is kind of going to be a really critical piece to moving forward in this space. And as the current system, again, what we've inherited here is a local climate regulation system that really cools off very quickly at night. It has ventilation channels associated with the washes that help, as the cold air forms in the mountains, it drains into the valleys, and to making sure when we do development that we keep those kind of regulation systems open and we don't sacrifice them like we've done in the Central Valley. And I'm going to show you a little bit more what I mean about that in a second. And again, just to kind of pull from the linkage design that was mentioned earlier, really that's based on a lot of the overlays of the hydrological system, but it also, again, integrates that atmospheric cooling system that is natural out there, and all of these things kind of coming together, and how we can actually integrate that and conserve that and build our cities within that. Or around it in terms of conserving that kind of system. And so here I want to do a little bit of comparison. It was done, actually, I think Scott did it as well, and I'm going to go to the same place, the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. And so we're going to kind of zoom in. We're going to kind of fly in through Google Earth and think about this system here. Again, in terms of you want to be paying attention to the way the air is going to be flowing off the mountain, the water is going to be flowing off the mountain, the natural recharge that's happening here, preserving the functions of those for not only wildlife, that the wildlife as well are going to be helping to manage that system. But then also what we've done in Central Phoenix and kind of understanding more the mistake that was happening here, or the sort of challenge, the design path that we followed here that has caused a series of problems. And in many cases, with this wash here coming up past Oa Peak, the channelized buried system that then goes into more concrete that degrades the water, causes it to be flashier, causes urban heat island in the meantime, right? There's lots of concrete the sun can bake into. And so all of those are not present in the system we have now. And how can we not do this there is kind of a key question going forward. Let's see. Next. All right. So, the key question I think to really kind of start to finish off here tonight is really around, will we conserve our ecosystem services that were given to us, or that we inherited, from previous generations, both indigenous communities that stewarded the land over time, other communities that maybe are new Americans that have come here that have preserved it for us. We heard a little bit about that tonight in terms of the White Tank Mountains, or will we build more of the same? And so I think that's kind of the key challenge. And if we don't want to build more of the same, then we have to come together as really diverse coalitions to help support this kind of work that the White Tank Mountain Conservancy is doing. And I'll leave it here with this. This is a really great, if people have not seen this documentary, it's really great. I'm not sure when it was done. It was done by the Sonoran Institute. I think it was the early 2000s, Making Sense of the Place, Phoenix, the Urban Desert. And this quote always, I read this to my students every fall. I teach a class called Ecosystems and Sustainable Design, and it's Phoenix is a place in conflict. Development has revealed a fundamental paradox in the American dream. We don't necessarily get what we want as a community when we pursue what we want as individuals. And so we need to work together across diverse environmental, economic, and social values and build those into the kind of West Valley that we want to leave our children. And so I'll end there tonight. I can take any questions. I'm not sure what else is in the chat, but thank you for having me, and I'm super excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Paul. If there's any questions, I'll, please go ahead and unmute and shout it out. While we're waiting for any questions, it's been really great to see as we kind of move through the night, the different sort of topics, right? We kind of zoomed out from at the beginning where we were looking at the regional picture of why we thought the White Tank Mountain area and region was important. And, from there, we started going then to the Ross, right, which called the creation of the green print. We then went to Scott and saw the different crossings that are happening, the different wildlife that we have in this region, and took a little bit of a closer look with that data with Dr. Jesse and Kayla, which is doing so much work. So it's been really wonderful to see, really what is at stake, right? What is it that we're potentially losing? And then to kind of wrap things off with Paul and seeing the importance of green planning, green infrastructure, and how do we incorporate nature into what we're doing, and how do we think about connectivity as we're moving forward into the future, and perhaps also taking into consideration what are those benefits that we're getting from nature that we could potentially lose, those ecosystem services. So such a wonderful sort of weaving of a story here, and again, we hope you can continue joining us. And if you want to learn more about the connectivity initiative, I know that there's going to be some links dropped into the chat that will help you learn even more and explore the story map, which Dana showed us earlier tonight. And so in order to kind of wrap things up for the night, we wanted to give the space to a wonderful, wonderful person. Her name is Sydney, and she's going to be sort of wrapping up with some spoken poetry tonight. And I will go ahead and introduce her. Sydney Ashby is a senior at the Herberger Young Scholars Academy at the ASU West Campus. She is extremely passionate about acting, the environment, and her family, and how these factors can affect the outcome of her craft. Her passion for poetry and writing began when she started at Herberger, where she was introduced to an amazing foundation called Poetry Out Loud. Through Poetry Out Loud, Sydney continued to gain more confidence through the recitation of poetry. And this past year, she was fortunate enough to compete regionally and statewide, being named the runner-up at the Arizona Poetry Out Loud competition. She is currently focusing on her academics and plans to continue pursuing both environmental sustainability and acting through college. And so we do have some questions in the chat. If we have some time at the end, we'll go ahead and try to address all of those. But I'll go ahead and pass it off to Sydney so she can share her work with us. Thank you so much, Sydney.
Thank you. Okay, this is Nature's Invocation. As we thrive and struggle through our daily lives, we put on a mask to disguise. Just underneath lie eyes sporting tearful cries, eroding cries waiting to resign, yet sentenced to repression. A fundamental defense mechanism of humanity. But where lies our civility? Our innate ability to protect, to provide reliability to those bearing the immutability of our actions, our faults undoubtedly projected onto our furry friends, foolishly pushing them to a forceful goodbye. Yet we think we are so wise, wise enough to rise above it all. No need to jeopardize our future when in my future, there are franchises with French fries on standby. Yet nature bears the back end of our demise. I'm left with only one question. Why? Then again, wondering why brought us these white granite cliffs. Yet now it stiffs as 158 years of history are at stake. So we are not to wonder if, as time shifts, take one last big whiff of humanity and evaluate where you sit and where we can sit. Untarnished, indulgent, all prescribed conditions of man, nature present before we began, as we grew together, hand in hand. Now, in retrospect, what happened to the connection? Abandoned with no plan. Threats emerge every day for every creature, who may not bear the same features as us. Nevertheless, they need a procedure in place that neither harms nor abandons their leisure in a world that is as much theirs as is ours. There's no more time left to disguise, only time left to reprise our love of wildlife and mountains oh so high. They've done enough complying to our inevitable demise. It's their time to thrive, to fly like the caged bird once was denied, to untie their fragmented bonds alike, as such the wind does as it brushes by, like a predator in the night. For now, our future is bright, as we reunite through our hope of inciting progress tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was amazing, so amazing. We're so grateful to have you here to be a voice for this future generation. And this is exactly the kind of the information that we're sharing tonight. The whole purpose of this series is so that we have a lasting legacy for our future champions like Sydney. Such beautiful poetry. In order to wrap us up for tonight, we're hoping that maybe, perhaps, Les can lead us with some closing comments. He wasn't able to start us off this evening, but I'm going to go ahead and try to pass it off to Les. Les, are you able to speak with us? Are you here? Oh no, I think we're having some issues with your audio, Les. Can you try again? Darn. Okay. Oh.
Good.
Oh, there
Can
you
hear
are.
me now?
Yes.
Can
Perfect.
you hear me now? Can you hear me
Yes.
now? Oh, good heavens. Oh, I'm so sorry all this happened tonight. The wonders of technology, right?
Les, do you have any? Do you want to close this off? If there are any comments that you
Yes,
want
I
to share?
do. Yes, yeah, if you would. Bear with me 1 second here. I'm going to hop back in here. First of all, that this whole presentation tonight, everyone realizes what a great assemblage of talent and information, and it's just hard to put it into words in the short time that we started this conservancy. And I think it focuses on the fact that we are in a major paradigm shift in order to redesign the way development happens and prevent what we can see in some of our surrounding mountains, and all of the things you heard tonight about how important all of this is. So on behalf of the Conservancy, our board of directors, our city partners, all of our team, all of the people tonight that participated in this, we just can't thank you enough. I think that you will look forward to the next 2 or 3 presentations because they are all, as I would say, significant as what has been presented tonight. What else can I say? It's just great. Thank you all. Thank you all for participating. This has been a journey with Dana doing what she's done with the website, with the story map, and starting out with ASU, as you saw. So over a period of so many 4 or 5 years here, we've really accomplished a great deal. And it all counts. Everybody in this room tonight, we all count. Everybody is a part of this. This collaboration is the only way it's going to work. And I really believe that with this kind of participation, we will be able to rework the old way of development and find a way to preserve this incredible place we have called the White Tank Mountains. So thank you so much. And the poem tonight, I'm sure all of you will be moved by that for sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Les, for those closing comments. And also, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We are closing off for the evening. Don't forget to join us next Wednesday, the next 2 Wednesdays at the same time, 6:30 to 8 o'clock. And this will be recorded. All of our sessions will be recorded. And one more thing, Les.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I forgot a significant piece of this. A lot of this work has been the result of a grant we received from the Nina Pulliam Foundation. Mm-hmm. This is a significant work, and they recognize it, and we're grateful for that too.
Yes, thank you so much for the support of the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust, which not only supports the White Tank Mountains Conservancy, but also the work that Casca does.
Casca, right? We're all partners.
Exactly. So thank you all so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. If you weren't able to join us for the full night, we will have a recording available. Don't forget to learn more about the White Tank Mountains Connectivity Initiative with the links in the chat. Also, yes, if you're interested in the BioBlitz that the Arizona Game and Fish and Scott are planning, there's some information in the chat for that. And yeah, thank you all so much.